Welcome back to KTN Newsdesk. We're glad you're still watching. Now, when we come to this side of the set on Newsdesk, it means it's time for a business chat. But I don't want to think of this as a business chat, as more a chat that could be beneficial to everyone watching. I'm talking to David Stanton, who is the Director General for Trademark East Africa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And your organization has a flagship initiative to the tune of about $53 million US. We're talking about the community charter at the Mombasa port. So perhaps you can tell us about the importance of this charter.
Well, Edith, I think it's a very important initiative because ultimately the price that all consumers pay for goods in East Africa is artificially too high. And that's because the cost of getting goods which are imported or exported through the port of Mombasa is also too high. So the members of the signatories, I should say, of the community charter have agreed to look at the productivity of the port, drive down those costs, make trade more efficient, and therefore make the costs of all consumer goods that are imported into the region, not just Kenya, much cheaper. So that's a massive benefit for the people of East Africa. So
is this why you're concluding that possibly this charter and creating a single window platform, as you've just mentioned, could double the trade value of East Africa? Absolutely. The analysis suggests that the volume of trade over the next 15 or so years, up to roughly 2030, will quadruple in size, the volume of trade, but it can only happen if the productivity of the port increases at the same rate. So the agencies concerned, public, private, civil society, have recognized that these productivity improvements in Mombasa are essential. They're not desirable, they're essential. Okay, so speaking of those entities which are involved, you've mentioned some public ones, private actors, special bodies, and to coordinate the activities. Who exactly are they? Well, there's very many, and the key ones, perhaps. The key ones at the Kenya Ports Authority are a key player because they are the custodians of the port facilities. The Revenue Authority is very important. There's the Ministry of Infrastructure and Trade are playing important roles here on the public side. And there's another authority called the Northern Corridor Authority, which has a regional role, looking at not just Kenya but also Uganda and Rwanda and even on to DRC. So there's many agencies on the public side, but meanwhile on the private side there are many private representative bodies that represent the interests of traders, shippers and freight forwarders. KEPSA is a leading player. There's the Shippers Council, the Association of Manufacturers, and the Charter groups all these different public and private agencies together. So quite a number of stakeholders. Indeed. And I'm glad that you've mentioned the regional regional players as well. These are the hinterland countries you've spoken about: Uganda, Burundi, South Sudan. Yes. How are they going to be affected by this charter? Are we going to see a lower turnover of cargo? What does this mean for them? It's very important because the costs in those countries, particularly the landlocked countries, are much higher than in the seaboard countries. For example, the price of a product in Burundi or Rwanda is roughly 40% representing the cost of getting that good from Mombasa to Bujumbura or Kigali. So you can imagine that they have a huge vested interest in reducing those costs and not only making imports cheaper, but also making it a more competitive market in which they can export. You can imagine that if a business depends mainly on imported inputs, it's going to make it punitively expensive to manufacture and export. So this is very important, not just for the price of consumer goods, but for the capacity of those countries to export. So I know for me, it will affect me because hopefully the consumer goods will be lower. For the big players, there are obvious benefits to this. But what about the smaller players, the people who work around the ports? How does it affect them? Equally important, because I think jobs are at stake here. And when you get a more effective and a productive port, and there have been major improvements in productivity in the last few years, so we're building on that, then it increases the economic growth, the volume of trade, the demand to invest in infrastructure and build infrastructure. So all that has an impact on local jobs and growth, not only for the traders who benefit from lower costs, but from local communities which can benefit from a more effective modern port facility. And I could add that also the same applies at border posts, where Trademark and other organisations are also helping to modernise
border posts in the region, seven of them in fact, not just on the northern corridor but on the central corridor from Dar es Salaam. So these are building job opportunities, wealth opportunities, and especially we hope amongst all our agencies to reduce the incidence of poverty.
The incidence of poverty, yeah. All right. We're also seeing, especially in this press release, that this charter is going to improve efficacy in the port, but we're not really seeing specifics of how that will happen. Do you mind taking us through that?
Certainly, yeah. There's a number of indicators that will be represented on what's called a dashboard, and these have been chosen by the agencies to represent the most important yardsticks of what represents a modern and efficient port. For example, the amount of time it takes a ship between the time it arrives in Mombasa and the offloading of goods. The amount of time it takes for those goods to be loaded onto trucks or onto railways or into pipelines perhaps, and to get out of the port. That's also being measured. And then you look at the time for those goods to get up the corridors to the border between Kenya and Uganda, for example, at Malabar, and on to the other countries. And so the Charter is representing the collection of productivity gains that it's seeking from the different agencies involved, and they will be represented on a dashboard that is visible and accessible to everybody. And we will be, well, His Excellency the President will be helping us with that on Monday at the launch of the Charter in Mombasa.
All right, speaking of the President, which brings in government, do you know of any specific things they've been doing to improve efficiency of the port? Because they are facing stiff competition. I think for a while Kenya has been riding on the whole idea of being a geostrategic country, which is true, but there's competition.
Yes, there's lots of things which the Port Authority has been doing. There's a plan to revise the legal and regulatory framework for the operation of the port, to extend land for further investment, to invest in small-scale and large-scale infrastructure. As you know, there's a new container terminal being built. We are supporting the government to introduce the widening of gates and the paving of yards and the improvement of facilities so that the port has the facilities and the systems to manage more effectively.
David Stanton, thank you so much for making time to be with us this afternoon from Trademark East Africa. If you have any more questions about this, do log on to our YouTube page, KTN Kenya. If you just type youtube.com/KTN Kenya, and you can find all the answers here. And I'm pretty sure once you get a link to this, you can be able to communicate with our viewers. All right, that's where we wind up this edition of KTN News Desk. My name is Edith Kimani. It's time for a Did You Know Fact. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice one today. I only have a disgusting one. Did you know that most lipsticks contain fish scales? Yummy. Good afternoon. Stay tuned for Samba Buzz coming your way shortly.